The real issue, though, for you as state legislators, in my opinion, is about jobs. I don't know that we have to talk so much about environmental protection and the environmental benefits, because I think if we don't deliver jobs for you, if we don't create those economic development opportunities, you wouldn't be in a position to recommend to your governors and to your colleagues in the legislature to move forward. So the first standard that I want to propose to you as you think about this and as you challenge us as an industry is show me the jobs. Because if we don't show you the jobs, you shouldn't show us the pathway forward in your state. It's economic development and jobs, particularly in today's economy where we have relatively low demand for electricity, lower electricity prices than we've seen in the past, although I think that's going to change, and higher unemployment. So electricity prices become a very important policy issue for your governors, for your utility commission, and for you as state legislators. So our mission is to show you the jobs. And in Europe, what I think is very interesting, Europe's been spinning turbines in the water since 1991. The United States has lost the intellectual property race to Europe, and now we are rapidly losing it to China. Rapidly losing it to China. China's going to overtake Europe. Europe's been spinning turbines since 1991. China put its first turbines in the water just a year or so ago and is going to overtake Europe in capacity in the very near future. Here we are, the greatest manufacturing country in the world, and we don't have steel in the water yet for offshore wind. So the data point that I'd like you to see is the first bullet under the second section here under the European Wind Energy Association, where they're talking about 375,000 workers employed in the wind industry and more than half, 215,000, in offshore by 2030. That's what we can do here in the United States. Bonnie used this map. I think she helped develop it. But what I want to talk about for a minute is the Great Lakes. Your Great Lakes governors were ahead of the East Coast governors years ago when they started thinking about offshore wind. And the reason they got ahead of you, they started before you, the reason they started before you is that they saw two very alarming trends. They saw the automobile manufacturing industry withering, and they saw the steel manufacturing industry withering, and they asked a question, what can we do with this great infrastructure, with this great capacity for manufacturing? How can we put it to use in a way that will put our people back to work who are already trained in these trades? And the answer was offshore wind. The Atlantic Coast governors and developers sort of caught on to this and the developers started working with the government offices up and down the East Coast. And really, the Atlantic Coast governors have now gotten way ahead of the Great Lakes governors. They're much further along in their policy and in their thinking about how to create the markets that are necessary for this industry to survive. You've seen some of this before from Bonnie, but if you look at the slide on the left here, you'll see the windy area of the United States, and on the right side, you'll see where the demand is, mostly on the East Coast, a little bit in the Great Lakes, some in California, Florida, Texas. So the problem that we have is that you can't get the wind from where it is to where it's needed, and that's why offshore wind makes so much sense, because there is a great windy area right along both in the Great Lakes and the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic. We also guarantee stable prices. Our fuel, the wind, is free. So for the life of our contract, we have a stable price. If you tried to enter into a 20-year or 25-year contract today with a natural gas provider for power, their price would be higher than offshore wind is today, because natural gas doesn't know what the price is going to be in 3, 5, 7, 10, 15 years. And therefore, to hedge an under-market contract down the road, they have to price that very, very high. So while we are an over-market product, when we look at this in the context of long-term hedging, we think offshore wind is a good bet. The regulatory framework is getting to be in place. We're still about a 7-year permitting timeline. We reduced it from 10 and 9 years with work that our advocacy group has done with the developers and with the great support of the Obama administration on offshore wind. We need to get it down to about 4.5. There are ways to do that. The range right now is about 5 to 7. We need to get it down to 4.5 years. That works from a financing point of view. It works from a development point of view. Gives us enough time to order the product, and it gives us plenty of time to negotiate the sale of the product. Right now, there are so many subsidies for coal, oil, natural gas, nuclear. that offshore wind, we just want to catch up. And I will tell you that a lot of times people say we shouldn't pick winners and losers in energy supply. If we don't give us some advantages now, indeed we are picking winners and losers. We're picking the incumbent providers and not giving new players like solar and geothermal, biomass, and offshore wind to catch up. So there's two ways of looking at winners and losers. We think the argument is let's get these subsidies and then let's figure out how to lower all subsidies for all users so that there can be fair competition. The bottom part of this slide is probably the most important thing that relates to the business that you're in as state legislators and policymakers. We need to have markets for this product. We have to ask you as policymakers to think about whether you're willing to ask your ratepayers to pay more money for a product that they could get cheaper someplace else. And to me, there's only one answer. The only way you get to yes on that is if you can provide other benefits to those ratepayers. And Governor Chris Christie has the model. I believe it's the model for the United States, and it will either be copied the same way or it will be modified and replicated in some other way. But the state of New Jersey has figured it out. They've gone to scale. So while Cape Wind is hoping to build 400 megawatts, the governor of New Jersey and the Public Service Commission there, the Board of Public Utilities, have said, let's start with 1,100 megawatts of offshore wind because we know that we need a critical mass to attract the jobs and the manufacturing and the economic development opportunities. And what Governor Christie has done, it's really very interesting. He basically said, I'm going to okay these projects if you can pass a cost-benefit analysis that the Board of Public Utilities will run, and the legislature, I think you were a co-sponsor, Senator Kane, the legislature passed a bill that created the standard for the cost-benefit analysis and then required, of course, regulations to be written by the BPU. This is absolutely the way to go. If the developers can't meet the Kane standard, they can't come into the state. And Governor Christie won't ask his ratepayers to pay more money. So then the question is, what is scale that's needed to get there? Because, oh, by the way, it's not just that there's 1,100 megawatts of power that's called for. There's a revenue stream on the back end that is guaranteed to the developers if they meet the cost-benefit analysis. That's the key here. It's the only state in the country that has thought about this. It's a guaranteed revenue stream, fixed price, 15, 20, or 25-year contracts if the developer brings enough jobs and economic development to the state. And each developer will come in with its own price and with its own job portfolio. And the Utility Commission has already started issuing RFPs to hire the expert firms that will see if our developers are exaggerating or whether they're being accurate in their predictions and what their guarantees are. So I think all eyes should be on New Jersey. Right now there are two regulatory processes going on in the state. One is to better define how the cash flows through to the developer, and the other is to reaffirm the rules on how this competition and review and cost-benefit analysis will go forward. I think it's a really brilliant strategy, and the part that makes me the most nervous is Governor Christie has a very easy way to get out of this if he wants to. He either says, you know what, I'm willing to ask my ratepayers to pay a little more money because I got all these jobs and all this economic development, or he says, guys, you are too expensive. I need to protect our ratepayers. I can't ask you to come in right now until you give me better benefits. We spend a lot of time with New Jersey officials, and we spend a lot of time with the manufacturing and supply chain. And let me just tell you about what Pennsylvania did with land-based wind in Bucks County when they brought in Gamesa, a land-based wind turbine manufacturer. Right after they did this, and I think your state should, some of your states are doing some of this, but I hope you do it in a more formal way, is Pennsylvania then established something called the Pennsylvania Supply Chain Initiative. And they wanted to identify the potential supply chain folks, businesses that could provide parts to the turbine manufacturer, Gamesa, that chose to locate in Bucks County. A turbine offshore or land-based, has between 3,000 and 5,000, 8,000 parts, 3,000 to 8,000 parts. They're not all going to be made by the turbine manufacturer. The turbine manufacturer is going to find its own supply chain. So in Pennsylvania, the supply chain initiative there identified 168 local companies that are now feeding in to the Gamesa-Bucks County project. And think about all the workers associated with those 168 firms. I will tell you that virtually all of your states have those supply chain component makers. They're not making them the products for offshore wind, but it's not very hard to change what you're doing and fine-tune what you're doing to serve this new industry. So if you're making ball bearings for some type of gear on land, making a ball bearing for an offshore turbine is not going to be very much different. You may need a different quality of steel, but you've got the forges, you've got the other equipment that you need. So this is what we need as an industry, and what states need to challenge us on is to show us the supply chain. It's not just the turbine manufacturer. That's a nice victory. It's a symbolic victory to bring that turbine supplier in, but there are 5 orders of magnitude more jobs created outside, at least outside of the turbine manufacturer, feeding in to the turbine manufacturer than the jobs at the factory itself. So we heard from ISO New England yesterday. He talked about some of the challenges. Those are challenges that we're going to face in a decade. And I want it to be really clear. PJM, the largest interconnect in the world, 51 million customers, 13 states, has said that they can handle 20% wind without flinching, basically. The New York ISO has got a similar study on this. There will be upgrades necessary, there will be retraining, and there will be need to manage this. But let me just tell you, in the next decade, we're not going to see these big projects in the water until 2015 or 2016. So to get to scale where there's pressure on these independent system operators is years after that. It should not be in your calculus. I don't know what you're planning to do in 10 years, but it should not be in your calculus. We need to be thinking about it, and the federal government should be, and policymakers should be, and certainly the ISOs should be. But it shouldn't be a question you're asking about what to do about first generation or even second generation offshore wind plants. That can easily be accommodated. And I believe that when we get to 10 years out, we will have figured out the technology for energy storage for offshore wind, whether it's batteries, whether it's compressed hydrogen or compressed oxygen that can then be released to spin turbines and create electricity. I believe when we get to that critical mass where the ISOs are worried about whether there's too much wind, we will be a baseload product. Baseload meaning we can run a flat supply into the grid at any time because we're either generating the wind or we're storing it and releasing it to keep a balanced output into the market.